Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday. It's Ascension Sunday. It's also in the Methodist Church Aldersgate Sunday, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. On Thursday, it was Ascension Day. 40 days after the Easter events, we celebrate, we remember, we scratch our heads about the ascension of Jesus, his leaving of the disciples in quite dramatic fashion, recorded in Luke's Gospel and in the beginning of Acts, written, we think, by the same author in the way that they talk about it, and the way that they describe themselves as the author of Luke. My favourite memory of Ascension Day is of gathering on top of York Minster. There's a very narrow winding staircase, I forget how many hundreds of steps there are, up onto one of the towers at York Minster, which is, I think, still, what do you mean still? I think it is the largest Gothic cathedral in Western Europe. In Europe, I'm not sure, but it's big and it's tall. And at the top there is a flat sort of viewing platform. And my chaplaincy colleagues and I, when I was at the university, would go on Ascension Day every year at 7 o'clock in the morning. We would gather, have the minster entirely to ourselves, get given the key by security, and we would open the door, unlock it, and head up the stairs to go and have Ascension Day worship on top of the tower. The top of the tower is, I used to call it a giant hamster run in the sky, because it is entirely caged for very sad reasons, because there have been people who've chosen to take their own lives off places like that, and off that place in particular. So it hasn't been open to the air completely for a very long time. But we used to gather, and we had a gospel choir, and we would have some readings and some prayers and some time for students just to wander around and enjoy the view. And we gathered in rain, in snow, in sunshine, in every weather, as the vagaries of sort of April and May in the UK came our way. If you go into York Minster and you look up at the ceiling bosses, the roundels that connect the arches across the main transept, the main body of the church, I'm giving away my lack of architectural knowledge of cathedrals. The gospel story is told in the bosses, in those decorative mouldings that sit in the centre, and this is what the one looks like for the Ascension. I think it's great. You got the disciples looking up with their eyes closed, it would seem, some of them, firmly adoring the soles of the feet of Jesus disappearing into the clouds. I think it's great. You wonder how else you could tell that story, really. How else would you show that in that kind of space, in those kind of dimensions? So what's Ascension about? Well, it is an essential part of the story of God entrusting God's self and the world to human beings through the whole of history, and particularly the story of Jesus. Beyond the death of Jesus and his resurrection, he appears to the disciples a number of times. There's some teaching, there are some miracles, there are all kinds of things that happen. And then we reach this moment that we read about in the first chapter of Acts. I won't read the first bit, but from verse 6 onwards. So when they'd come together, they asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom of Israel?" And he replied, "It is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And when he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going and they were gazing up towards heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them, and they said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up towards heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." So, quite a few things there to chew over if we wanted to. The second coming, all kinds of things. But I wanted this morning to talk about the humility of God and the confidence that God places in you and I as people. Not that we are sort of lords of the earth, and in the old kind of reading of the Genesis narrative, that we are now, we're left in charge of everything, but that God, it's not that God has given us authority so much as God believes in your and my goodness and potential and creativity and and growing wisdom, an ability to together somehow shape the world in a way that, as I've said many times before, places love, kindness, goodness, generosity, inclusion, welcome, responsibility, forgiveness, generosity, grace. I think I've said generosity twice now. All those things at the center of our lives. So I want to say two things about the Ascension this morning. Firstly, I think it is important to think about the Ascension as an expression of God's humility. You see, Jesus gets out of the way. He leaves not because he can tick off his list and his job description is complete and he's fulfilled his task and his fixed term contract is over, and he goes off for his generous pension at the right hand of God in heaven. Jesus gets out of the way. And it's one of those moments where, a bit like when you have someone in your midst who's very good at something, and any conversation or attempt to express or do that thing that they're very good at, they just get deferred to again and again. Jesus has been spending his entire ministry creating a radically democratic and egalitarian society where all people are equal. And there is a sense in which if he hangs around as not only God's resurrected Son, but as the obvious expert in everything from praying to, to morals and ethics, and we need an answer, let's go to Jesus. At least he'll tell us a parable we can sit and think about, because on our own we just can't work it out. Or we're not confident enough to choose ourselves what the best thing is to do. Jesus gets out of the way. And he gives the disciples the opportunity to find all of God within themselves, not in some outside agency or some wisdom from the expert. Now, of course, the danger of that kind of thinking is that we become quite arrogant, or there's a possibility of some arrogance. But long before it sounds like we're beginning to say Jesus gets out the way so that we realize we have everything we need within ourselves. Actually, the gospel is about coming home to the fact of God placing God's life within us from the very beginnings of our life, and our task through all of life being to have as much fun and make as careful choices as we can, even those that might choose the opposite of fun in our lives, and to find and trust and express the fact of God living within us. I've used the illustration before, I know in Haxby once, I think, and I used to use it on top of the Minster when it was my turn in the cycle of the chaplains taking a turn to share some thoughts on Ascension Day. The image I'd use, the great thing about students is that every 3 years there's a whole new bunch, so you can use the same story again. The image I always used to offer them was of my mother teaching me to ride my bicycle and running along behind me with her hand under the seat. And there comes a point where she has to let go. She has to let go in order for me to learn to balance on my own, in order for me to become confident in my ability to ride my bicycle. It might seem like a trivial example, but it is one of the best illustrations I've heard or come across in terms of the humility of God in this moment, doing that thing that is so hard for us as parents sometimes, to let go of the saddle, knowing that the child still has a lot to learn about riding their bicycle, and that once we've let go, we can't suddenly grab hold of it again. We give up control. We might set some boundaries, but we give up essentially control over the child's course on their bicycle. Aldersgate Sunday in the Methodist tradition is about that experience John Wesley had as an ordained Anglican priest, as someone who had already been in a missionary capacity overseas, who had done all kinds of really good things about poverty, had taken his place in the social evils of society in terms of trying to remedy them, and gone to the church as a place for the waifs and the strays and the rejected. But he has this experience. He has this experience in his life where he goes reluctantly to a meeting and a Bible study, and someone reads from the preface of Martin Luther's commentary on Romans. And he says, his own words are, "I felt my heart strangely warmed." Now, this isn't just a sentimental thing. He goes on to say, in that moment I knew that God loved me, that God accepted me, that God held me, that I was, I'm paraphrasing again, but essentially perfectly good enough just as I am, with a lot more to learn. A transforming moment for him, a deeply powerful moment. And I think that in order for that to happen, there is a sense in which the ascension has to happen. God has to get out of the way for us in trying our hardest to discover that we're always going to be in need of deep inner experience of acceptance and love. You see, essentially John Wesley came to realize that God was at home inside of him, and that made all the difference in the world. I don't know what your experience of God or faith or yourself is, but I do know that for most of us, we struggle to believe in ourselves as much as we might. We tend to look back and see our failures far more than our successes. We tend to diminish our gifts and skills, and we tend to brush aside really important and potentially embarrassing compliments that come our way. We're not good at being told that we are precious. We're not good at being lauded for being who we are. We're not good at being held up as beloved. And one of the great themes of the gospel is the discovery for each of us that we are God's beloved. Whether we are on the inside or the outside of those who were considered the outcasts or the favored ones in the story then, or how we perceive ourselves now, it doesn't really matter. The journey for everyone, the great task of the social and radical reform of Jesus in terms of faith and politics and life, takes root most deeply in a deep, surprising inner conviction that we are God's beloved. And it's not about arriving into that. It's about discovering that and then feeling the implications and consequences of it. The second thing that Ascension Day is about, that I want to talk about today, is about failure. The other thing that Jesus does by getting out of the way of the disciples' lives and letting them carry on in their own capacity is that he must know that they're going to fail. And they do fail, and we see them failing. They bicker, they argue, they are no less human the moment after this happens, and even beyond Pentecost, which we'll talk about next Sunday, this Holy Spirit thing, this event that takes place, that is part of cementing their confidence in at least what they have to share, if not themselves entirely. That the other thing that happens and needs to happen for them and needs to happen for us, again I'll use the image of letting go of the bicycle seat, is the inevitable consequence of that letting go, is wobbling and falling and bruising. It's inevitable, isn't it? It's inevitable. And it remains, for me, one of the most important things that we will ever do as human beings, whether we are people of faith or not. One of the most important things we will ever do as human beings is to dwell healthily on our mistakes and our failures. We learn more about ourselves in our wobbling and our falling than we ever do in our triumphs and our victories, however large or small they may be. The place where we grow, the place where we become, the place where we soften, the place where we become generous spirited people, the place where we begin to take ourselves less seriously than we previously have. I guess the great freedom that comes in the joy of being ourselves and the difficulty of being ourselves and not clinging on to things too tightly All of that arrives into our lives most powerfully through failure and the lessons we learn from failure. It's one of the hardest things, again, to do as a parent. Letting go of the bicycle seat means maybe a grazed knee and a few tears. Scratch on the bicycle frame. But I know how often I've sat over the years with parents agonizing over the failures. Not disappointing failures, but the painful and costly failures of their children in their choice to have to let them go and make up their own minds about things. And that's ranged from serious drug addiction to unwanted pregnancy to academic opportunity frittered away to to far less serious things, just to general lifestyle things. And we want the best for our children, but we don't want them to wander in a circular path and find their way in the way that we did, or many others have. It remains true that we want our children to learn the lessons we've learnt. We don't want them to go through what we've been through in order to get there. We can't square that circle. It just remains true. That's so much of our growing up, so much of our becoming human, so much of our becoming good to be around for ourselves and others. It comes into our life through failure. And in the ascension and in the stepping back from the kind of sort of the immediate presence of Jesus in the lives of the disciples, where he is their continual fallback, they are left to make up their own minds. They are left to form community themselves. They are left to sort out the rules. They are left to deal with the complexity of a whole new way of doing life, never mind faith or politics. And of course they fail. Of course they fail. But they are not their failures. Their failures are the makings of them, in the same way that our failings can be the makings of us. So I want to leave you with those thoughts today about Ascension. We can debate the kind of historical accuracy of it and whether it really happened and what it means, and the whole second coming bit and who these two men in white robes were. And I guess we miss the point, because there's always a deeper lesson, a deeper opportunity for us in our thinking and our reflecting. And today I'll offer you those two things. God respects you enough to get out of your way and not to dictate your life, or to be an ever-present rescuer. God trusts and respects you enough to believe in the possibility that you are, in all that you've become and all that still lies ahead. That is what God does for the disciples in the Ascension. And secondly, God doesn't set them up to fail, but God makes room for them to learn in the only way we learn the best lessons in life most powerfully, which is usually through failure. So what failure shapes your life? What have you learnt about yourself through the things you've got wrong? What does it sound like to you to have me say to you this morning that God believes in you, perhaps a lot more than you believe in yourself, that God respects you a lot more than you perhaps respect yourself? God sees in you more than you perhaps see in yourself. But that the way to discover that is to wobble and to fall most of the time. So the disciples carry on in their confusion. They're not sure what to do, and then they head towards Pentecost. And next Sunday we'll talk a bit about that, because it's Pentecost Sunday, and what it means for this image of fire coming upon them, and confidence arriving into their hearts and their minds, and the ability to speak of what they know to be true in a way that is convicting, that isn't just about ideas, but is somehow about the truth of what is real and good and loving and transformative. Talk a bit more about that next week. But I'll leave you once again with this image. The feet of Jesus. He has very odd toes. Extremely long, big toes in this picture. But I'll leave you with this image of the best we can do sometimes to imagine the ascension as we tell the story of Jesus and all of his life and death and resurrection. And today the story of his taking his hand off the saddle to let us learn that we can ride the bike, and that we're going to wobble, and that we're going to fall, and that all of that is actually in some way that isn't always easy for us to understand or to see at the time. Good news, and part of God's gift as we discover ourselves and discover love and share that in every way that we can. So bless you on Ascension Sunday. And I'm off now, as you know, if you've been watching the videos, if you watch Fridays, I'm off now for a week, so I'll be back next Sunday for the first time. And if you're not sure what's happening after that, if you go back to Friday's video, there's a bit of an explanation about how these reflections will be shaped from then onwards. Have a lovely day. Cheers.